and welcome to the Mental Health Mukbang, where we try to make mental health easily digestible. My name is Jed. I'm a therapist based out of LA, and today I have this giant bowl of watermelon.
I'm Cheng, based out of Raleigh, North Carolina, and I am eating dumplings.
Classic.
Yes. I'm Jenny Wang. I'm a clinical psychologist in Houston, Texas, and I am having, I don't know how to say it in English. It's zhou geng or ma geng in Taiwanese and Chinese. It's like a kanji-based protein, but there's no rice in it. Protein soup.
All right. I'm Christopher Vo. I'm an LMFT from Houston, Texas. I did the most Texas thing I could find and brought this giant beef rib.
That's huge.
Yeah. And today we do have a special guest. It's Lisa Cheng. She's in social work. Last week we talked a lot about George Floyd from a mental health perspective, how to navigate and start some of these difficult conversations. But we wanted to bring in someone who's this is more their wheelhouse to kind of guide us through some of the more advanced part of this dialogue and what to do after.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I have an almost finished bowl of watermelon, so staying with Jed here.
Let me just send you some right now.
Running low on watermelon.
Like strawberries, can give you some.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for joining us, Lisa. No, we were just having a little chit chat before our show. I have dumpling in my mouth. I guess that's the mukbang thing. And last week we just were processing together. This week things seem a little bit more clear, which means we want to take some steps. We want to really get involved. What does that look like? And there's different angles to that. So I would love to just begin by opening up the conversation. You said some great stuff with let's start with activism. That word, what does that look like to you?
Yeah, thanks again so much for having me. For me, activism has a lot of avenues. Activism is ever changing, and every person has a role. And I think there's a common image of activism looking like picketing at the front lines, burning things down, and making like huge social change right away. And for me, activism is not a sprint, and it's a marathon, and it's a long-standing fight and battle for equal rights for all. So that's how I operate around for activism, and that's how I try to. I know in your last episode talking about sustainability and talking about how to take care of yourself. As an activist myself, it's really important to take care of yourself as well as continuing on the fight. I think I saw a tweet that was like, it doesn't matter what lane of activism you're taking up, as long as you are taking up one and you have your foot on the gas. So okay, take a break, but continue to push on, even if it just means you're crawling for a little bit. So that's personally how I operate around activism. I know that's not the same for everyone, and that's totally okay, because like I said earlier, like everyone has a different role for what they play in our society, but also in activism in particular.
Mm-hmm. Question, kind of following up with what you just shared with us, which I felt like was such a accessible way to understand that idea of activism. Do you think educating yourself is an act of activism, or is that not quite at that threshold? Because I think a lot of us are trying to read and trying to understand more, but is that in itself an act of activism, or do we need to go beyond that, right? What does that look like?
I think it's hard for me to judge whether something is or isn't activism necessarily. However, I think that education is a major, major piece of activism in general, because how can you fight for something if you don't know what you're fighting for? If you don't know to what degree that you should be fighting for it, right? What are you supposed to do if you, like, why would you drive somewhere if you don't have a map or Google Maps, or where would you go, right? Mm-hmm. Education is certainly a major piece of what a lot of activists draw upon for their wheelhouse, for their knowledge on the issue. For anyone who is kind of like dipping their toes into this for the first time, I encourage education to look like have a lot of diversity. Like, read a book, read some articles, but more importantly for me, engage in discourse with leaders, engage in discourse with other activists, and take their knowledge and take from what they are saying and take gems from that and use that as a part of your education as well. So sometimes I hear the narrative of just like educate yourself, and that is a really hard place to start for some people who are brand new. So I definitely encourage seeking out community leaders, seeking out people who are involved in the cause, and ask, what about this is important to you? Or what are you fighting for? Or what is this all about? I'm a little bit confused. If you have time and energy, please tell me your thoughts.
No, I really like that. I was going to say, so along the lines of that, what I've encountered, not necessarily personally, but I can see it happening, is pushing that gas pedal to really get involved, and seeing myself, and I'll just use myself as the example of engaging with community leaders, conversing. I'm an extrovert, so I tend to like that. However, I think the hesitation could be, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, on not necessarily saying the right thing, because that's not what we're really trying to do, but really making sure that we say or speak to the point that we're not offending, right? Because everybody at this point is a little bit emotionally charged. And then I've seen people speak up, and I'm commending them as Asian Americans, and I'm like, that's awesome. But then they have told me, no, I obviously said the wrong thing. And then I think to them, it silences them. That's not the word I really am looking for, but just kind of pushes them back a little bit, going, so maybe I will release the gas pedal, hold the brake. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of people are feeling emotionally charged and exhausted in a lot of different ways. And people's patience is thin, and that makes discourse online, that makes discourse in person challenging. And so there's this one podcast that kind of changed my entire views on activism in general. And the podcast is called The Radical Therapist. So I would highly recommend it for anybody. But the guest that they had on that episode was a Chinese trans woman who is also an activist, who is also a therapist. She's just awesome. She's amazing. But the major criticism that she had of the activist community was activism continues to demand perfectionism, demand absolute accurate language all the time. And that contributes to this cancel culture that so many people are critical of. And for those who are unsure of what cancel culture is, that's just essentially casting out someone who uses the wrong language, or canceling them, making them completely irrelevant to the cause forever. There's no opportunity for retribution, no opportunity for any sort of redemption. And this is essentially just a way to cast them out of the community forever. And unfortunately, this is really common in the activist community. And that's a major criticism of the guest. And she specifically notes that as a trans woman, she was expected to hold this really intricate language, really difficult language, that she only knew that she was trans. She had no clue how to navigate the language yet. So kind of off that soapbox, essentially activism continues to expect perfectionism. And I'm going to say it even if it's not perfect. Speak up even if it's not great. And even if that is scary, say it anyway. And it's okay to start out imperfect. This is probably the first time many people are engaging in these conversations. And it's like learning how to ride a bike. You have to start out with your training wheels, and then you take those training wheels off, and then you go.
I'm going to repeat that. I like that. Say it again. Yeah. Say it anyways, even if it's, what I don't know if I want to repeat what you said. You didn't say
even
wrong.
If it's not perfect.
Oh, even if it's not perfect. That's it. Because I want people to hear that because they feel like they have to say it perfectly,
Sure.
you know? So I like that a lot. I'm going to repeat that to myself.
Yeah. You're going to have to fall a few times before you get it right. And in those moments where you fall, in those moments where maybe someone will say, hey, that wasn't the right thing to say, or you could have said it better, or you should have said more. In those moments where you feel really vulnerable, I encourage those who are engaging in these conversations for the first time to do some introspection, take that as constructive criticism. These people are telling you this because they think you can do better. And be kind to yourself as well. Like, know that like that was your best effort in that moment and that you should still be proud of that. But then also think about ways how you can continue to push that conversation, how you can continue to improve your language. How can you say that in a way that's less problematic? And the truth is, we will always be problematic. Every single person. We are not free of our own biases. We are not free of our own background that we were raised from. And so sometimes we're going to slip up because we're human, and that's okay. As scary as that may seem sometimes.
I always use the analogy of like, it's like someone showing up for work for the first day, right?
Yeah.
How asinine is it if you don't put them through orientation and you just expect them to know all of the nuances of this brand new job, right? That's what a lot of people are doing right now. They're trying to show up for something that they've never done before, and then you're not putting them through orientation. But I also want to talk to a little bit about from the other perspective, right? Because obviously that's my viewpoints on these things, of my frustrations with gatekeeping, allyship, and radicalism and these different things. But we've had some discussions personally about the necessity of radicalism, right? Can you speak a little bit on that? Like, we can talk about why we're frustrated all day long, but I also want people to try to empathize with why and how it exists.
Absolutely. For me personally, a radicalist is a moderate who is fed up, frustrated, and exhausted. Mm-hmm. So when taking a look at radicals, why they feel a certain way, people who are on the outskirts of the political spectrum, and asking yourself, why are they acting this way? Why are they saying these things? Why are they so on? Mm-hmm. The question is, what got them there? The question is, how can we zoom out and look at the bigger picture and ask, why do these people feel so strongly about what they do? And to answer your question more precisely, Chris, it's important to have both radicals and moderates at the table when it comes to political change, when it comes to advocacy, because you need someone to shake hands. You need someone who's at the middle, who can discuss these issues with congressmen, with other people who have power, and you need people who are burning stuff down to get your attention because you're not paying enough attention. Right. When talking about protests, one of the major frustrations that people voice to me is like, well, why did they block the road? That doesn't do anything. That didn't change my mind. And it wasn't supposed to change your mind. It was supposed to grab your attention and make you ask, why the heck are these people blocking the road right now? What is going on right now that they are blocking the road? What is going on now that they're burning this building down? What is going on? Mm-hmm. It's supposed to make you ask why. Right. And when they find the answer to the why, which is, yes, another unarmed Black man was killed by the police, yet again, with no justice at that point, then they can take a look at like, wow, it's really serious right now. This issue is now thrust into the forefront of their mind, right in front of them, and they have to reckon with that. So protests from radicals or any sort of actions from radicals are just as important as moderates who shake hands at the table, because they continue to push the narrative further their way. I would have to say a majority of people who are leaning progressive but also more moderate have the same values as someone who is a radical progressive, but the methodology tends to differ. But both methods are necessary for social change.
I love that. That was.
I think that's definitely key of what you said in terms of like a radical didn't start at being a radical, and that's the part that we forget, because the way information is thrown at us constantly, we tend to label and stereotype based off this one limited interaction.
Right.
But it's important to connect with that humanity and remember that they got there because of repeated frustrations
Absolutely.
of lack of change, right?
Yeah.
And radicals, I think, a lot of times are necessary too, because like you said, it forces the shift, because the status quo has been the status quo for hundreds of years, right? Mm-hmm. So to take that and move it in any meaningful way, you have to have a radical idea, thought, right? Because we also talked a little bit about it, like performative activism, right? One of my friends linked me an article of like this performative activism where they like drew a mural on the ground and pretended to be asleep for 8.5 minutes, like George Floyd, right? Representation. And then get to go home and say, by golly, we did it. We beat racism today. But in all reality, you did nothing but make yourself feel good, right? It didn't actually change policy. It's not actually voting. It's not actually, shifting the people in power. And that's what this is really about, right? It's not about just voicing what's going on. It's about actually, hopefully, making meaningful and lasting change.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There is a lot of criticism on the activist community or people who are engaging in these conversations for the first time because it feels performative. It feels like a feel-good moment. Like, I put a black screen on my Instagram and now racism is cured. And I truly hope that nobody actually thought that that was it. And there are a lot of social media influencers who are speaking out about racism and Black Lives Matter, police brutality for the first time, which a lot of activists, we've talked about this, feel irritated because this fight has been going on for so long. And for whatever reason, right now is the time for people to wake up to it. So a lot of activists do feel frustrated with this performative activism. And I'm going to say that like I said earlier, like activism has its lane, has all these sorts of lanes. And as long as we occupy all of them, we're in it together. So as irritating as performative activism may look sometimes, I'm going to call for it. I'm going to ask for all those social media influencers to say it because they have a platform that we don't.
Still shift the status quo a little bit, right?
Oh, I like that.
And I'm thankful that they're saying something, and I'm going to push them to go further. It's great that you've engaged in this conversation for the first time. How can you build on that? How can you further than just put a black screen?
What else can you do?
What else can you do with your 50,000, 100,000, 300,000 followers you have on Instagram? What else can you do? Mm-hmm. Think about all the good that you could do with that.
I like that you gave it a word, but just performative activism, or, I just like that. It doesn't sound great, but still, I like that you said we can fill all the lanes. Mm-hmm. People need to hear that, right?
We need everyone to pull the rope right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if someone else, I have this question that you brought up. So going back a little bit, you said something interesting. So why are people now, what's going on now? We've been through this before. George Floyd isn't the first victim of police brutality. What is going on today that it made people wake up? Part of me feels like I could assess and have some sort of, but what's from the viewpoint of an activist, how would you answer that? Like, what's making people come out today and now finally it's being addressed in the way it should, or we're making moves toward that?
I think it was the cumulative effect of Ahmaud Arbery being murdered, Breonna Taylor being murdered, and for those who may not know, Tony McDade, who was a trans man who was killed, police, and then
back to back.
It was like boom, boom, boom.
Yeah.
all of these deaths not only were of unarmed people, unarmed Black people, by police, or by vigilantes, and further, like, none of it was justified. Nobody could find reasons why these people deserve to die. You know, I saw like some narrative with Ahmaud Arbery they were like, well, he was like in this house before and people thought he was suspicious. And like, and if, did he deserve to die? And the answer was no. Nobody could pull together a reason why these people deserve to die. Breonna Taylor was in her bed sleeping when she was shot to death, right? And there was video evidence of George Floyd suffocating to death under the knee of a white police officer. You know, so I think there was already a lot of understanding. So the first time I was involved with this was Ferguson. I was in high school and I was like, wow, like this is really happening. And that was the moment when I really understood what it was like to shout Black Lives Matter and really fight for that cause. And I think there is a combination of factors of like time since Ferguson, a lot of my generation, and then also the cumulative effect of 4 Black unarmed deaths in a row, none of them being justified, none of them having justice yet, right? And people were tired, sick and tired of seeing another Black person die at the hands of law enforcement.
Yeah, I just had to, I was just, had to ask that. Yeah.
Yeah. Zooming out, you can really see how exhausting it is to continually watch someone who looks just like you die.
Yes.
And with the system completely being okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
There are still so many Black Americans who have died at the hands of law enforcement who have not received justice. There are children who have been shot by the police and have not received justice. And so people are sick and tired.
This might be a controversial question, but what do all of you respond to the Asians whose response to all of this is, but we experience racism too, or the Black community has been racist to us, or we have racism, right? Like we always call it the oppression Olympics, right?
Yeah.
What is your response to that part of our community?
Yeah, and for anyone who like has that point of view, we can experience racism too. It's not as if because Black people have it worse that we cannot experience racism, but I'm calling upon my other Asian brothers and sisters to empathize with the fact that it's not the same. And then to zoom out and take a look at why it's not the same. Asian exclusionary politics is not the same as kidnapping people from the shores of Africa to come and work for free, be slaves, and continually have that intergenerational trauma passed down onto their children, onto their grandchildren, and so on. And for a lot of Asians who come from traumatized backgrounds as well, there are many Asians who have fled their home countries to come to other places, not just the United States, for refuge. And it's not as if those struggles are invalid either. But again, it's in the United States in particular, that's the frame I'm operating around. It's not the same for Black Americans. It is truly not at all. And we can take a look at, I can go into this for forever, as Chris knows, but we can take a look at every single American policy that has ever been raised and take a look at how it continually pushes down Black and brown people, Indigenous people in particular. And so we can really take that zoom out lens and look at why it's not the same. And so we can hold both of these things true at the same time. Asians can experience racism. We've seen it with the rise of COVID and anti-Asian xenophobia that has happened around the world. And we can recognize that the 400 plus years of intergenerational trauma that Black people hold with them every single day, while also watching people that look just like them die on the screen, it's not the same.
Yeah, I feel like there could be parallel processes, right, going on. I thought it was interesting that Chris used the word controversial. I just had to ask why did you say this may be a controversial question?
Because, I mean, in subtle Asian mental health or in all the forums, when all this exploded, that's typically the narrative that I see of, hey, we should support this. And I would say like 70-30. 70% are like, yeah, we definitely should support it. And I'm sure there's people who are silent, but 30% are like, no, we don't, because we experienced this, I've experienced this, we've experienced this. And I was just wondering, as clinicians, how you guys view that.
I could start.
Whoever.
I guess, to be authentically honest, I feel like I understand. I am an Asian American. But sometimes I will say, when it gets to be, I mean, people are saying, oh, it's not about you. I don't even want to use that word. I'm just saying, when I tend to get irritated is probably because I see people kind of gearing up and not ranting, that's the wrong word, but they'll say stuff and then I'll just realize they're just saying stuff and not choosing to at all empathize. Or maybe that's just my interpretation, but I feel like that. So I empathize. I know, I understand, I'm an Asian American, right? But when I see them go on narratives that I'm like, I don't know if they're choosing to even take that first step to see. And again, that might be me being judgmental because we have our own biases, right? Mm-hmm. But that would be my answer. That's where I would only get a little upset or irritated when I see someone and I feel like they're not trying to empathize or understand what I call accurate empathy, to really get into the other person's internal perspective, just like they would want. So maybe they weren't heard, right?
Sure.
That would be my answer to that. But anyways.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
No, I would echo. Oh, sorry. I would echo that in the sense that I think when I hear that kind of feedback, I'm like, whoa, there's some like deep racial trauma work that needs to happen here for this person, And so it doesn't trigger me. Like, I don't get upset because it's almost like what you said, like what happened to them to get them to this point of not being able to support, right, people who are getting brutally like murdered on screen. Like, what is it that it's like a humanitarian issue, and they're probably good people, right? Like, they believe in the sanctity of human life, and yet they cannot. And so I'm more so like, what are those barriers that are keeping you from reaching that point? Yeah. And I think I think a lot of Asians, like, it's almost like because we didn't have this like identity of saying, well, we're Black, and so we had this very like overt racism against us. We felt like we couldn't even say we had racial trauma. Like, it felt like it wasn't something that maybe was part of our narrative. And so in doing that, we've just said, oh, well, it's just discrimination. It wasn't trauma. It wasn't this. And so a lot of us maybe haven't even investigated our own experiences. Yeah. And so I think my question for that person is like, man, like, what have you been holding back that feels so painful that you need to react in this way?
Process.
Sure.
Very, very good therapy question.
Yeah. Yeah. What about for you, Jen?
I think at the core of it, it's always there's something going on for people that we don't necessarily understand. And I think that for a lot of these people, they have justifiable reasons for them to feel that way. And I think a lot of it is, that invalidation that they've probably been experiencing for a long time, to where even now it comes to a head and it's like, wait, hold on, this happened to me, but nobody ever said anything. And so, like, why would I unilaterally back somebody or a movement that is representative of someone who had hurt me, right? And I think it's very easy for us, like, from a clinical perspective, these overgeneralizations are how people make sense of the world. And it is limiting, right? When somebody says, yeah, I was attacked by an X person, right? Whatever that person is. And then they generalize that to an entire population, right? And so that, I mean, at some point, somebody out there is going to perpetuate a negative stereotype about themselves. And I think a lot of people pick up on those pieces, a lot of, I guess, people who are hesitant or people who are unsure about supporting an entire movement are, I think a lot of where that comes from is a place of personal experience that they haven't quite processed. And I mean, I think I know for sure that like their experiences are valid. What they experienced was something that they experienced, right? But how they've dealt with it or how I haven't dealt with it leads to a lot of where that comes from. And I know that might make a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And I think it is always uncomfortable to explore your own internal biases and your own experiences in the light of something like this, right? But I think trying to correct, I guess, from my perspective, what I would consider like a cognitive distortion of something that is like very all or nothing or overgeneralizing in terms of in the therapy room, it's helping them come to terms with the fact that things can be both and it's not this or this. That people can be good and bad at the same time. And that there is a place where you need to reconcile those understandings, right? I mean, I think it's in a sense, it's very similar to people who have experienced emotional I guess one of the things that comes up very frequently in Subtle Asian mental health is the issue of parents, right? And then I read a lot of overgeneralizations, like all parents are like this, right?
Okay.
I think it follows the very same, it follows a very similar vein of thinking where like, because this happened to me, all of the people who fit into this category, right, are going to be like this. And so for a lot of people in our group, it's all parents. Like there's like anything any type of parent says, like it's immediately invalidated by the fact that they're a parent, right? I think in the same vein of what's going on now, right? Black people did this to me, and therefore any black person is going to fall under this umbrella or category of what I've already experienced, and that's it, right? And I think it comes from a very similar place. I mean, I can't say for certain, there are a lot of other systemic issues at play when it comes to racism, just because of how many different, at least for us as Asians, right? We come from a place where we have a little bit more leeway due to the model minority myth, right? Where we are quote unquote closer to whiteness. And so we don't exactly experience the same kinds of disadvantages that communities that aren't as close experience, right? And a lot of that, part of that is socioeconomic. Like as Asians, generally, we are afforded better kind of, I guess, environmental luxuries to a certain extent, just to be a little bit better off financially helps a lot to kind of mitigate some of the pressures, like the systemic pressures that most people would feel. And I mean, you can see that in a lot of Southeastern Asian communities where they're not as well off as, say, their East Asian counterparts, and you can see the differences there, and don't let anybody who tries to tell you otherwise, like, don't believe them, because that's like, if you look at all of the statistics, it's a fact that people from these kinds of populations experience the difficulties that are sometimes associated with racism. And so taking a look at that too and seeing how that all kind of ties in to this current issue, I think a lot of people are looking at it in a very black and white way. And without looking at it from a broader perspective, it's really hard to see the movement as opposed to this is the group that hurt me. And I think those are my thoughts about that specific, I don't know what to call it, scenario, I guess, that Chris brought up.
I just realized I was muted. You know how you mute yourself and don't know that you mute yourself?
Happens all the time.
I was going to say, it almost made me think when Jed was talking about, and Jenny said it too, what have they gone through to have that reaction to what's going on now? Other Asian Americans and that 30% that Chris is talking about. I was almost going to say, should they recognize perhaps what they're dealing with? They may find that they are actually experiencing something very similar to their Black activists, or, you know what I mean? BLM. Does that make sense? And so that thought just came to mind that I just wanted to share. Yeah. It's just getting there. And so not Jenny, but Lisa brought up something really cool about what do you think about this? I've heard this before, and tell me what you think about hearing this statement. You can't try and change someone's opinion. You can't try to change somebody. What would you say to that? Because that's what activists try to do, right? Have you see, their point of view and vice versa. But then you hear some people saying, I hear activists saying, don't even bother trying to get them to understand. I've heard that, and I've heard both sides. What does that mean? And how can you frame it?
The issue is that, like, coming from, like, I primarily do one EFT, so emotionally focused therapy, and two, I primarily work with couples, right? And what I would say is the problem is typically people, instead of crafting the message towards the receiver, they're talking at people, right? So you can yell facts at someone all day long, but if you don't connect with why they feel how they feel, you will absolutely never change their thoughts or opinions, right? And that's how I would approach even the previous question of how do I respond, because that's what I hear from the Asian community. A lot of the white community, I hear police brutality exists not just in the Black community, or similar arguments to that, right? And my thought process behind that is, like, really listen to what you're saying, because it's the same thought process of, like, Black Lives Matter being met with all lives matter, right? You can't say all lives matter, Black lives don't matter, right? If you're saying that racism exists in the Asian community too, helping fix it in the Black community will also help racism, highlight racism in the Asian community, right? If you're fixing police brutality when it comes to the Black community, it's going to help solve police brutality in the overall system. But because you're getting caught up in the semantics and screaming at each other, nothing's getting accomplished there, right? Mm-hmm. So connecting with the empathy, I think, is really crucial always when talking to someone else.
And then Lisa touched on trauma. So let's just admit that's what's going on, right? Re-triggering all types of trauma.
Absolutely. And how you guys were talking about, Asians are probably not being able to voice their own hurt, right? I know that's a really good question of figuring out how to elicit that, how to bring that out, and then guide and build that connection with what's going on.
And so I think that brings up a really good question, or I guess a place to kind of wrap up, right? You brought up how do we communicate, right? And one of the most important ways in this kind of communication, and one of the things that I feel like, or that I feel very strongly about as a therapist, is how do we get somebody to change their mind, right? And I think it can't happen without meaningful connection. The same way that therapy helps change people's minds. In essence, that's what we do in therapy, right? Somebody comes to us and is like, I don't like how I feel about X, Y, or Z. I have a problem with X, Y, or Z, right? And the whole process of therapy is to figure out what they want to change their mind to, and then helping them to get there.
But they have to realize it for themselves, right? That's what we're always taught in, school, and what we do in therapy is that we can tell them what it is that they think. But if they arrive to that conclusion themselves with us guiding them, it's much more profound and longer lasting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but I mean, everybody's able to kind of chime in on this, but what I'm saying specifically is, unless we build meaningful bridges with people, there's no way we would even have the opportunity to be able to change, to help them even think about even open their mind to other perspectives, right? Because otherwise we are just talking at them. Because unless your position with a person is meaningful enough to where they're going to listen to what you have to say, like genuinely listen to what you have to say, then there's no way to even begin that kind of conversation. And so, I mean, there are other ways to go about it, but I'm saying that fundamentally is what we need to do. And I think Jeannie was the one who brought it up earlier, where you start from a point of mutual understanding. Or that was Jenny. Jenny said it. We start from a point of mutual understanding. Somebody said it.
Somebody said it. I don't know. That sounds good. Sure.
But
yeah, and Jeannie, you brought this up earlier that we want to. This is like in our discussion before we started, but how do we frame issues in a way that is digestible for someone who may or may not agree with us? And how do we change someone's mind? And how do we give them more context? So for me personally, I don't try to change anyone's mind, actually. I personally operate around values, around what we can find commonality around. And for the most part, people have a lot more in common than we differ, right? And people tend to hold similar values. And so how can you frame and give context to an issue that seems undigestible to them in a way that is easy to break down? So how can I give you more information that supplements your own values and let you, whoever I'm talking to, make those conclusions on your own? I've had conversations with people about race, and 3 years later they contact me like, hey, I was thinking about that conversation we had 3 years ago, and now it makes sense to me now that I've gathered more information on my own. One of my best friends grew up very, very conservative and denied any sort of information that I tried to give to him at first. And then a few years later, I now see him on Facebook posting a lot of things that I would have posted myself. So I'm like, hey, what was going on for you that changed? And he said, I just wanted to look for that information myself. Mm-hmm. And like Chris said, you can't make someone see the way that you want them to. You have to give them the information they need to make that decision themselves. They have to arrive at that conclusion on their own. So the best that you can do is to give context, give information that supplements their own values already. And if you want to challenge those values, you can. It's just that people are very value driven and will most likely not budge on that. So Jeannie, when you were talking about don't even try, is what some activists are saying. And if those values are vastly different from yours, that's when you need to pick your battles and really think about which hill you're willing to die on that day. And if it's trying to change the mind of someone who has really different values from yourself, then I would probably scroll past that one. But if there's someone who's holding similar values online and they're just kind of struggling and grappling with, okay, I don't understand this information, if you can provide that education, that context, that information, if you have the emotional labor available to do that, those are the people that you should look for to try and change their mind, or rather for me, add context.
Sure.
No, I love that. Values. I mean, that's what activism is about, right?
It really is.
Believe in, right? So that's awesome. No, I love that you said that. Sorry, Chris, I might have just interrupted you.
No, you're good.
Okay. No, I thought that was a great way to really wrap up what we were trying to say. But then I had one other thought, and then I just forgot what it was because I was trying to swallow the dumpling in my mouth.
I'll say something and then see if it comes back for you. But I think to circle back on last week's talk, because of that, we have to really emphasize having a safe space for these talks, right? Because there have been times where I've talked about something, and that's how I process. I think that'd probably eventually be a good video to do, because we know what processing is, but laymen may not necessarily know what that means, right? But there are times when because I have never voiced those opinions out loud or thoughts out loud, it's only when I speak it out loud in a conversation, and in the middle of it, that's when I go, oh wait, no. And actually am forced to critically think about it and go, that's not right. I'm definitely wrong in this. I'm going to keep saying this point because I'm pot committed now, but I'm definitely going to analyze it a little more after this, right?
Yeah, we have to give space for people to fall and trip and make those mistakes and give them the chance for redemption. And as activists, not everyone is going to give you that. And especially those of the most marginalized identities, they might not give you that. You might have to be okay with that, which is a hard truth to swallow. But as Asians, we have a different experience. We have a different experience that we're operating around. And sometimes we can give more emotional labor for redemption and for any sort of retribution that can bring them back into the community. So some activists call this calling in instead of calling out, where you bring that person back into the community. And
I like that too. I'm going to use that.
To try that, or just to try that if you have it.
I see more calling out, or we're using that word, but I would love to reword that, reframe that, say calling in. I know what I was going to say, actually, because you were talking about this, giving people safe space. Time is what I'm hearing. So let's be honest, this is, you said it, and I've heard this from many activists, this is a marathon. And so I feel like people want to quickly just step on the gas, which is great, but I meant they want to step on the gas and then be like, hey, done, check off. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but I'm saying I want to be able to be sustainable, or all of us to see that sustainability, so that we know that this is a long-term change, and change is also uncomfortable, right? I use that all the time. People don't want to be comfortable. I mean, of course, I would love to be comfortable. Be like, yeah, I want to be comfortable through this, but it's going to be uncomfortable until we can see some sort of change. But yeah, this is a marathon.
Absolutely.
And it's also like important to look at it in, like you said, in the long run. It's easy also to become cynical, right? Because after Ferguson, nothing happened. After Garner, nothing happened, right? After Crawford, nothing happened. All of these events have culminated into what's going on right now. And there's a chance that nothing will happen now, but we have seen this huge influx of dialogue that, we hope to carry over, right? I talked to Lisa a lot about that of, in these fields, in social work, sometimes you have to accept the fact that you might not see meaningful change during your career or your lifetime, but it's the hope that it, gets there eventually, right? These baby steps that lead to that.
Yeah. Most social workers have to reckon with the fact that they may not see in their lifetime at all the change they're really hoping to see. And society moves a lot slower what a social worker would want to see happen for society. And so you have to understand that your efforts may not come to fruition before you, but you have to know that your efforts are not wasted, and they continue to build for future activists and for future people who fight for the cause.
Awesome. I love that. Yeah,
Jenny?
it was so great having Lisa here. Sorry, go ahead, Jenny.
No, I was saying that was like a perfect way
I
to
know.
end this discussion, I think, because I think for a lot of us, we are not social workers per se, but we have to believe that we're like planting some seeds and watering and hoping that something shifts. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, it was
Thank you for
awesome.
having me. Really appreciate it.
We'll have you back for sure. I finished all my dumplings, so it's like perfect timing.
All my watermelons finished.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining us.